Let me start by making a brief observation, trying to link some themes from the film very quickly with our topic in the discussions tomorrow about these mysterious black notebooks that are less mysterious now that they've been published in Germany. What's mysterious? And I've discussed this with the editor, Peter Trovny. What was Heidegger thinking? How did he think people would react when his innermost thoughts and reflections on the 30s and the 40s were revealed? Obviously, he wasn't thinking in a way, but that doesn't do justice to the problem because of the coherences that are multifaceted and times tricky between his thought, which he renounced philosophy, and he called his thought thinking, denken, and its resonances with the era and the zeitgeist. I just wanted to make a remark first before posing a question to Jeff, our filmmaker, that I think some of the German voices we heard in the film are remarkably upright and self-critical and reflective. And it's not just some of the figures we saw in the film, Rainer Martin, Bernd Martin, and others. I was extremely impressed last spring upon reading the profusion of reviews, very serious. The feuilleton section of literary sections of major German papers are something to behold, in fact, from which we could learn much over here. At the objectivity, the seriousness and profundity and lack of apologies on the whole with which these issues were treated. I think this says really something about a theme in Germany that was taken up and foisted on the Germans against their will, very much by the Frankfurt School, and specifically by Theodor Adorno in a famous 1959 lecture called "What Does It Mean to Work Through the Past?" An allusion to this Freudian concept of working through the past. Adorno and the Frankfurt School and others made this a topos or a theme in post-war Germany, and I must say, as someone who's gone back and forth between North America and Germany for 30 years on and off, first as a German academic exchange service grant recipient, it's almost a miracle the way, not to be apologetic on my own, the way German democracy has prospered. We had one commentator, I think it was Bernd Martin, remarked that Heidegger totally lacked civil courage. This isn't true of contemporary Germany. And this is a remarkable transformation that we can't deal with at length in this context, but I think that something that's come out in Jeff's film and is now a part of German political culture in the way it was never true before. This is remarkable. In many ways, it shows a learning process that's very impressive. And if one compares this learning process vis-a-vis the tragedies of the Nazi era and transgressions to other nations that have experienced these events and are in denial, one often speaks of Karsten Harries, hopefully is joining us now. This is quite an impressive development. With having said that as a frame, I have a question for Jeff, and then we can get the ball rolling with the discussion, as it were. But let me stop quickly to introduce our panelists. I wasn't sure with whom we would be left at the end, but I'm very pleased to introduce to you some of our participants in tomorrow's seminars. First, Emmanuel Faye from the University of Rouen in France, whom you saw speaking eloquently in the film. To his left, Karsten Harries, who has taught at Yale for a number of years, and along with Thomas Sheehan from Stanford, I'm full of admiration for both men as philosophers and as figures who have used Heidegger's work in a non-dogmatic way, in a creative and original way, and in a critical way, by the same token. To begin the discussion, let me ask Jeff briefly a question I'm sure you're often asked, to begin with, what motivated you to make this film? And secondly, do you have anything more to tell us about its reception in Germany after the debacle at the premiere in Freiburg?
Okay, thank you. First, I would like to salute everybody in this audience for sticking around for this film. I apologize for the technical problems. As my son Jason says, Dad, it's a long, boring 2-hour film about a humorless German philosopher. So thank you very much for being here. To start out very simply, I'm Catholic. That is, I was born and raised a Catholic, and as my old Catholic school buddy says, once a Catholic, always a Catholic. And I first heard about Heidegger studying philosophy in a Catholic seminary with a priest professor who introduced us to Heidegger. And then I went on to study. I left the seminary. I decided the priesthood was not for me. And I went and got a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree in philosophy. And I was, for many, many years, a very enthusiastic Heideggerian. And then something happened, and what happened was a landslide of books that came out around 1989 to 1991. And that was a book by Richard Wolin, a book by Hugo Ott, by Tom Rockmore, and of course the book by Victor Farias. And I was really quite upset to discover, 40 years after the war, that Heidegger was a Nazi. And then there were those that said, no, he was not really a Nazi, he just kind of flirted with it. And then I read a really key article in the New York Review of Books by my colleague here, Thomas Sheehan from Stanford, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I came home from the library after reading that article, and I said to my wife, I'm going to make a film about Heidegger and Nazism. And so that's the reason. And then, of course, I invited Richard Wolin. I was teaching at that time in the Media Arts Department at the University of Arizona, and I invited Richard Wolin to come and talk, and if I could do an interview with him in the television studio. I was the director of the TV studio at a PBS station at the University of Arizona, and Richard was very kind to come, and I invited him, of course, because he's written 2 or 3 major works on this topic. Well, that was 1994. And I remember looking at the original 16mm film with the clapboard, and it says March 1994, and I shot it in 16mm color film. At that time, my wife's health took a very bad turn, and I put the film in the cellar, and it sat there for about 9–10 years, and the original negative had decomposed to such an extent that when I had it transferred, Richard's face was dark green and purple. So I salvaged it by turning it to black and white. So, I mean, I've seen this film so many times, I can't watch it. It's just, I see all the mistakes and things I would do differently. But I'm still very, very pleased at the reception it has gotten literally around the world. I've been invited everywhere to show this film and to engage in this topic. So I'll leave it there, except to say that in Germany, the Germans just say, hey, Heidegger, everybody knows he was a Nazi. They really, and once the Black Notebooks came out, Professor Travny, who published them, has been on television several times, and German television is very good at bringing these topics to the fore. And so I agree with what Richard Wolin just said, that German democracy is indeed very, very strong. Now, having said that, there are some cultural types in Germany that hark back to the good old days and really are devout Heideggerians. But let's just continue with some other colleagues who I'm sure have more profound things to say. Thank you very much for coming, by the way.
I find the evolution of Jeffrey von Davis extremely important.
I think you probably need to speak a little.
Anyway, I think the best thing should be to have a discussion with. Have you some question to Jeffrey von Davis?
And as you can see, there are two microphones placed on either side of the seat, so please feel free to approach the mics with questions. Please.
My name is Beate Hein-Bennett. I was born in Germany in 1945 and grew up in that long silence. So thank you very much for having broken through that. And I think sometimes it takes 30, 40, 50 years to break through, if not more, in the third generation to speak. I have a question with regard to the choice of personalities. Of course, it's understandable that you would choose people who knew Heidegger personally. But I was also wondering if you, in your listening and speaking with others, spoke with the next generation of students who are students of Heidegger now in Germany. And if you heard anything that is not in the film, but that you could share with us.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I spent 6 hours with Hermann Heidegger, the son of Martin Heidegger. And I have to tell you, I liked him. His life story is in many ways far more interesting than Martin Heidegger's. But he loves his father, and he's out there to defend his reputation, even though there are certain things that cannot be defended. Having said that, the material that I had from that long interview, I was not allowed to use. And almost from the beginning, it was clear to me that Hermann Heidegger wanted to control the project. He wanted to, he wanted to have a say on how he was edited and things like that. And as a journalist and as a filmmaker, that's something I could not allow. At the University of Freiburg today, the philosophy department is headed up, I think, by Figal and another fellow, von Hermann. And they're very pro-Heideggerians. In fact, when I showed my film at Freiburg University for the first time, the premiere in Germany, von Hermann came up to me. I didn't quite know who he was, and I was in the back, and the film hadn't yet started, and he said, "Who's responsible for this?" And I said, "Well, I suppose I am. I'm the director." And he said, "Well, how did you get this room?" And I said, "Well, I've been invited by the history department." And as I was telling this to another friend, he said, "Well, why the history department? Your film's about philosophy." I said, "The philosophy department at Freiburg didn't want a thing to do with it." So these things still go on. The pro-Heideggerians, the anti-Heideggerians. And I have to say that I appreciate it when there are people highly critical of the film, because I'm very critical of the film, but it certainly enhances the discussion and the give and take.
Yes, please.
I thought the film was great, but there are certain things that I think really bear some emphasis and examination. One is Heidegger's notion of authenticity. I gather that I know something about it, and I gather that that's accompanied with this call of conscience. And the call of conscience, as I understand it, is unbidden, involuntary, an inner, privative insight whose expression is resolute silence. Heidegger exhibited this silence after the war. And not only does the call of conscience entail no overt communication, but also, as I understand it, has nothing whatsoever to do with any explicit code of ethics. No explicit code of ethics. Now, the other thing that I think is curious is why must we comply with the notion of existential dread as the inauguration into authentic being towards death? There are other ways. How about the biological approach to death, where death is considered as no survivor? Death is no survivor. It's bound to the body's tether. It's a finite biological end.
Is there a
so I'll stop
question?
all that. I'll stop all that. I'll stop talking.
That's okay. But it's all very interesting and important, but I'm wondering what your question is.
Okay, all right.
I think there was a quick question in there, is why I didn't present certain people or talk about this issue of authenticity. It's a very important question because in the beginning of the film, Victor Farias talks about how Heidegger talks about authenticity or Eigentlichkeit. The Frankfurter School was highly critical of Heidegger when they brought out their book called The Jargon of Authenticity, Jargon der Eigentlichkeit. And what Farias says is that Heidegger asked the question, how do I know if I, as an individual, am being authentic? And can that question be applied to das Volk? And he turns it. What applies to the individual person can also apply to the folk. And to go on with what you said, that this authenticity or this sense, it's almost a call in and of itself, independent of everything else. And of course, that's what a lot of German Nazis thought. So, but to go back to your other question is, I grew up in a tradition of moral philosophy. You know, I was taught theology and I was a scholastic for a while. And the biggest mistake is to see Heidegger as a moral philosopher. He is not. He's totally separate from those kinds of questions.
I agree.
But if I can,
please, yeah.
Please, I have something to say about Heidegger's silence. You spoke about that. And at the end of your film, there is an important moment about the problem of that silence, especially when you ask to Alfred Denker, is there anything in the complete works in which you can find a kind of answer coming from Heidegger about what he thought when he did in 33. And now with the end of the complete works, with the Black Notebooks, the problem is to know, is there something like an answer? Yes, there is no more silence coming from Heidegger. There is an affirmation of a strong radical anti-Semitism. And he planned to have it as his last word for his complete works. He says, my work, they are not works, but it's a kind of way, nicht Werke, aber
Ways.
ways, yes. And the end of that way is that affirmation of a very radical anti-Semitism. So it would be, I think, tomorrow the problem. My eminent colleague, Professor Karsten Harries, thinks that there is no change with those new books. I think that really the problem is changing now. It's not anymore the problem of the silence, but the problem of the what Heidegger said. And if I can, no, okay.
Yeah, I would like to express a certain worry. I loved the film. I want to thank you. But I'm afraid if this conference tomorrow is going to do significant work, really advance the discussion, it will have to focus on the Schwarze Hefte, not rehearse a topic which by now I ran a conference 20 years ago, and it was basically the same material. And there are some little mistakes which cropped up here again, which were cleared, should have been cleared up years ago. For example, that name Baumgarten was mentioned, the Baumgarten affair. Baumgarten wanted to join the SA. That should have been mentioned. And the letter was written not to, you know, to prevent a poor student from getting a little money. It was written Heidegger thought he was not a good candidate for the SA, and I suspect after the war, Baumgarten would probably have said, no, I was really not a good candidate for the SA. But these little details, and about many of these comments, I could add little footnotes, which would put a context and a very different light on a lot of these events. For example, the expression Judentum, which plays a big Verjudung, Judaisierung. Verjudung was a word which was quite common and was used by Rathenau, famously, much before Heidegger. It was common, and Rathenau cannot be accused of having been somebody who was particularly anti-Semitic. But he used that term, so we should see that in the context of the time when these words were spoken. It's very difficult for us to put ourselves back into that time.
Look, Karsten, I don't mean to interrupt you, but there's a big difference when Walter Rathenau, who was assassinated by a right-wing thug in 1922, and Martin Heidegger uses that term. They have completely different valences in 1922 and in the 1930s in the context of the Black Notebook. So this potentially confuses the issue. Actually, the word Verjudung goes back to Martin Luther. Luther uses it in his late writing on the lies and practices of the Jews.
But I think it's important not to isolate these and just focus as if this were the first time that these expressions were used. That's clearly false. Yeah. And I think there are a lot of situations like that where we need to contextualize. Mm-hmm. But I also hope, as I said, I ran a conference where Hugo Ott was present and so on, and especially Alexander Schwann, who has not yet mentioned, but if you want to read somebody, he's dead now. But one of the best books here, I think, on this is by Alexander Schwann. I want to just mention him as an important person.
If I could just interject, I think the greatest service of all is a service to truth. And I would like to say that you're absolutely correct about Staudinger and his interest in the essay. But Baumgarten, excuse me, Baumgartner. But it makes no difference because Heidegger thought he was a Jew and therefore used the term Verjudung.
I don't think that Heidegger did. He knew that he wanted to join the SA, and he couldn't have wanted to join the SA if Heidegger knew that he was a Jew. I don't think Heidegger thought that at all.
No. In fact, with Baumgarten, you have two episodes. And there is the first episode in 29, when Baumgarten want to have a grant. And then Heidegger is supporting him. Baumgarten is not a Jew, of course, he's the nephew of Max Weber. And what is important as an answer to Karsten Harries is that in 29, when Heidegger speaks about wachsende Verjudung in Deutsche Universitäten, he says to his correspondent, Viktor Schworer, that I cannot say it publicly or directly. It's just a private letter. So it's rather, I agree with Richard Wolin, it has nothing to do with the use of the term by Rathenau in 22, of course. And in 33, 34, Heidegger broke his friendship with Baumgarten, and he had to give an advice when Baumgarten wanted to join the SA, and then he didn't help him anymore. He said he had a friend, he was a friend of the Le Juif Frankel, and so there are two different moments, in fact. I'm sorry to be precise, but...
What I want to I hope that we will talk about the Schwarze Hefte. We are now talking about something which, as I say, there's an endless literature on these issues. All of that has been talked over and over. And if we are going to have something to say which advances the discussion, then let's look at what has just come out. These 3 volumes, these Schwarze Hefte, which are hard to read, but they're definitely worth discussing.
Well, we have
instead of going back over material, which we have gone over so many times, at least those of us who have participated in conferences of this sort.
You know, I think you're absolutely right, but I think there are several people in the audience that maybe have not gone over this material 100 times. We have some questions over here.
This question may be somewhat tangential. I'm curious about Hannah Arendt, the degree to which she was close to Heidegger and had to know specifically about his Nazi involvement, yet after the war and up till his death, she seemed to have been devoted to him. There was this film that came out not too long ago that showed her to be completely supportive and never critical of him. Can anybody discuss her continuing support of Heidegger and why and what that was about?
I have a little bit to say about that.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I would like to recommend to you a dissertation I directed. It was for Frankfurt by Tatjana Tömmel. It was immediately picked up. It was on Der Liebesbegriff by Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger. It was immediately picked up by Suhrkamp, just published as a pocket book. And if you can read the German, this is, I think, that has really changed my reading. That's one of the few things about Heidegger I've read in recent years that really has changed the way I read Heidegger. So I recommend, I just want to make a plea for that book, not by me, but by that woman, Tatjana Tömmel.
Well, in fact, I've written on this subject. There's a lot to say. There's even, most of which I won't say for the sake of not repeating what's out there already, but I do want to answer your question briefly. There's even more to say now that 2 weeks ago, a breakthrough book that's been discussed in the Times twice by Bettina Stangneth, Eichmann Before Jerusalem, has come out, published in German 3 years ago, which, in a nutshell, totally destroys the banality of evil thesis, at least vis-a-vis Eichmann. I've actually written a review of the book. Actually, it was an independent article that appeared as a review a week ago in the Jewish Review of Books. The one thing I want to say about this issue is that, of course, this was an insuperable conundrum for Hannah Arendt, who had such profound loyalties to German cultural, philosophical, and intellectual traditions, and excelled at having assimilated and internalized these traditions. And then suddenly, in 1933, as we see in Jeff's film, she realizes, like many other assimilated German Jews, Wittgenstein is another good case in point, that despite their bold and concerted efforts to assimilate, they're Jewish. Hitler made them Jewish, and nothing would change that. So there is a continuous process on her part, as I said, almost unmasterable or insurmountable, of trying to sort out her German allegiances. She abandons philosophy explicitly in 1933, 34. She says in an interview in the early 60s, the intellectuals and philosophers were the worst. I expected poor treatment from everyone else, but not from my philosophical peers. Subsequently, she called herself a political thinker. She only came back to philosophy proper in her last book on Thinking and Willing, the life of the mind. So this is a process that wasn't only peculiar to Hannah Arendt, of course, but to a whole series of very gifted German Jewish emigres who had to come to terms with something that was almost instinctual or intuitive. Instinctual or intuitive, this attachment to German cultural ideals and traditions. Thomas Mann, who went into exile wisely in 1933, said shortly after the war, there are not two Germanys, a good and a bad, but one Germany that through a pact with the devil, he's the author of Dr. Faustus, of course, through a pact with the devil, managed to realize its worst. There's been a long-standing process of sorting this out. Even Herbert Marcuse, Tom, you have a remark too?
Oh, you go ahead, please.
Just quickly, even Herbert Marcuse has come up toward the end of the film who writes Heidegger this impassioned letter in 1947, imploring him, you're the person, Marcuse wrote a Habilitationsschrift, second dissertation under Heidegger. He implores him in this letter, which is extremely moving. You're the person from whom I learned philosophy at Freiburg University. What I and my fellow students would like to hear from you is a word of contrition, a word distancing yourself from this terrible regime, which, if examined closely, was the negation of everything Western philosophy has stood for. Heidegger responded in a very dismissive and arrogant way, this is a profound indictment of this.
But if I could just say 2 books, if you're interested in the love relationship or affair, the intellectual and sexual relationship between Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger, Antonio Grunenberg, who directs the Hannah Arendt Center at Oldenburg University, has written a book called Martin und Anna. And then there's this woman from Yale University who wrote a short little book about that relationship as well. And just go on the internet and you can find it.
Okay. We have a question over here, please.
Right. I assume that the movie was made before the black books were discovered. So, first of all, I don't really know what the black books are. There was no one has really explained here in the podium here. What are they? Are they diaries? Are they something, a manuscript to be that he intended to have published? Was it hidden for years or what? Secondly, would you have made the movie different if the books were discovered first? Would you have made anything different in the movie?
I would have added a few things, that's for sure. But Richard, you should answer that question because you wrote about it as well.
Yeah, just briefly, and ideally, the editor of the Black Notebooks, Peter Travny from Wuppertal, was supposed to be here, but who knows? Yes, these are they're intended to be the final 8 volumes of the Collected Works edition, which will run to 102 volumes now in the spring. Heidegger's publisher in Frankfurt, Klostermann, published volumes 94, 95, 96, and these volumes take us, there's one volume missing from 1931, but from 1931 to 1941. And this is kind of a philosophical notebook, more sophisticated than a diary. People have compared them with Nietzsche's controversial testament, The Will to Power. They are polished entries. It's a philosophical, in German you'd say Denkbuch, or book of thoughts. So it's a series of bona fide philosophical reflections that have Heidegger constantly in dialogue with the zeitgeist and these cataclysmic events that are taking place during the 30s with Germany's conversion to Nazism and then the build-up to war. And so you have this entwinement of high philosophizing a la Heidegger and an attempt to make sense from the standpoint of what he called the question of being, or the history of being, of Aktualitäten, current events, in light of his philosophy. And there have been some translations of the most disturbing passages from the books. They're 1,300 pages, but the extent to which he's in solidarity, he's critical of specific practices of the regime, but he's, when all is said and done, very much in solidarity with the regime's goals. And he has this conviction, as it comes out in the film, that the German folk is the solution to the decline of the West, if it heeds the call of being. And we've had the motif that's come up earlier of Heidegger's delusion, as expressed by a colleague who knew him, that he could lead the leader. Den Führer, Hitler of course, führen, analogous to Plato's misguided attempt to play philosopher king to the tyrant Dionysius in Syracuse. Would anyone like to supplement what I've said on the panel? Okay. Then we have another question.
Thank you. I'm not sure what to conclude from your documentary. On the one hand, you make Heidegger seem like a philandering, sleazy opportunist. Is that what we're to conclude from this? Secondly, there was enormous turmoil going on in Germany and Eastern and Central Europe for the 3 decades, up to this time. You don't provide any context. It seems as if the German university was filled with so many elitists that they were simply rode above all the chaos that was going on below them. Is that true?
Well, to answer your first question about the sleazy aspects, I mean, sex sells. I don't mean to be glib about it. But I had a beautiful part in that film with the Princess von Potterville, who had this absolutely wonderful intellectual relationship with Heidegger, which was also sexual. And I had this fabulous interview. It was serious. It deals with the vagaries of the human heart. Human beings, after all, fall in love. They have affairs. They do bad things. They do good things. But I couldn't use it because of, as Richard said, the story of making this film is much more interesting than the film. My raw cut was 6 hours. I had some of these things in that you mentioned, but I had to cut it down or I'd never get it on television in Germany. And so, yes, there's so many things that are not there that could be there, and I made that decision and I have to stand for it. But yeah, but the relationship with Hannah Arendt is truly a remarkable and important relationship. And how can I say, we've all had serious love affairs with somebody when we were over 19 or 20. And I'm in my 70s and I can still vividly remember when I was 17. I can't make a judgment against the woman, but the fact is, he was the great love of her life, and she was just one of many. He was manipulative in this relationship, in my opinion.
Perhaps a small footnote, since we're on to the sleazy part of Heidegger's life. We shouldn't forget that Hermann Heidegger, who was mentioned repeatedly, his son, was not his son. His wife had had an affair before the whole thing started. And you could imagine that somebody of the esteem that Heidegger presumed, he was probably not altogether happy to have his marriage start on that note. Just as a small footnote, if you're interested in the sleaziness of...
I have another sleazy footnote. So stay in your seats for a minute. We mentioned, this will only take a second, and it's not irrelevant. I mentioned a minute ago that, strangely, the first volume of the Black Notebooks are missing. Lo and behold, another illegitimate son of Heidegger came forth this winter and said, "I've got it." There have been some, the general point here has to do with the editing of Heidegger's collected works. There's so much at stake here for Heidegger as a philosopher and for the German past. And this has been a real scandal and affects the way we view those who are in charge of perpetuating his legacy. There are pages missing. There are, in Peter Travny's little book, which I have here, there's a passage that is heinously anti-Semitic that has been eliminated from one of the lecture courses from the 1930s on a concept of being that Travny has put back in. It was taken out by one of Heidegger's son, actually the good son, not Hermann. But Tom Sheehan has met these people. The other son's name, Tom, is?
Jörg.
Jörg. So we're forced to deal with some very selective and willful editorial practices at the same time. Question?
Yes, one quick comment, one question. The comment is, it only seems to me dangerous. Ultimately, Heidegger's philosophy is a philosophy without psychological man, and I think that one of the dangers in evaluating him and evaluating the Black Notebooks, which I've not read yet, is to take him, in a sense, at his word, as if he were not a psychological man. And I think a bit of the interviews in the film come across that way, that it's all a matter of his philosophical thought, of his conviction. Sometimes people go as far as his background, but there's not much in his work that really welcomes psychological man. You could make some analogy between Sein and Freud's system on conscious and Dasein and consciousness and get somewhere, but it's a system that himself really avoids any kind of interiority, one might say, and I think you risk evaluating him on his own basis. The question I really have is about the film, which I think is a great film, and so many of these documentary films fall apart, and I think whatever your modesty is, there's no need for it on the film. I think it's really a terrific film. The question really is about making it, in a sense, without the blessing of the family, and I'll tell you why the question comes up, and it comes up because of what's going on this fall in New York at the Metropolitan Opera, which will be the death of Klinghoffer. And without getting into the merits or the merits of that work, which I think is dreadful from a librettist point of view, and Alice Goodman, who deserves Hannah Arendt Award of a kind. Leaving that aside, one of the difficulties of the making of the opera is that they didn't get the consent of the children. So you have people who go on with the historical view without the consent of the family. And I wonder if you might say something more about your sense or dilemma. He's a public figure, where Klinghoffer was not, of making a film and going into investigation, obviously totally without the support of a lot of people around him. I'd be very curious to see how you felt about that.
Yeah, remember the scene, it's unforgettable, it's a gift for a filmmaker, where I ask Alfred Denker the question, is there anything that you've found in the Gesamthaus, in the collected works, where Heidegger reflects about what happened after 1933? And Alfred sits there and says nothing. Now, I was in that interview and I just threw that question out. He was answering questions right and left and I threw that out and I expected a simple yes or no answer. The reason why is because Alfred Denker is one of maybe 5 human beings on the planet that has total access to everything, both in the Heidegger family. He's a personal friend of the Heidegger family. He's caught between 2 poles, Jörg Heidegger and Hermann Heidegger. Hermann Heidegger is the bastard child, which is a terrible thing to say, but when that was brought up, they went explosive. They wrote letters to the newspaper and everything. But Hermann himself broke the story and admitted that he was, and that secret was kept in the family for almost a half a century. He was told never to say this by his mother, Elfriede. Then you have Jörg, who's the real biological son, who's not as smart and doesn't have the career. In fact, he was so bad at school, he couldn't get his Abitur there, so he went to Stuttgart to get his Abitur. And there was a woman who directed the gymnasium in Stuttgart, was one of Heidegger's girlfriends, who had a son who has the other black book that's been missing for 50 years. I mean, it gets really complicated. I don't know what I was going to say, so I'll just let it go.
Gets complicated.
Yeah. Please.
2 questions. One is, what is the relationship between Heidegger and Carl Schmitt? I would be particularly very interested in that. Did they talk to each other? Did they write to each other? Did they have any type of, during the Nazi era, were they friends? I don't know it. It would be very interesting to know that, because we could see some parallels between both figures later. And also, I get the feel, I saw this film actually at Oberlin College when you showed it there. So I was there and I talked with you at that time. So it's very good to see it again. I get the feeling this second time that out of the movie, and this is connected to my second question, but out of the movie, there's the feeling, particularly with the song and about this kind of sing-song, silly thing about being, I get the feeling out of the movie that the ugliness of Heidegger, the anti-Semitism, the whole playboyness of it, destroys the philosophy. So my question to the panel, do you think the ugliness of this really sink the philosophy? Does it destroy or not?
I want to speak very briefly to the first question, but to the second question, I would answer no. Heidegger and Schmitt did not know each other well. However, in August 1933, this is 3 months after Heidegger joins the party and gives his now infamous inaugural speech as Nazi rector of Freiburg University, he writes Schmitt a letter, short letter, which has been published, translated into English, asking Schmitt to join in and play a role to assist the rise and consolidation of the Nazi movement as the most prestigious, along with his opposite number and find or enemy, Hans Kelsen, the most prestigious German jurist writing during the 1920s. Schmitt took the bait with alacrity. I don't think he needed Heidegger to egg him on, and made a number of very severe compromises, praising Gleichschaltung, writing Gleichschaltung legislation early in the Hitler's rule, praising the Night of the Long Knives with a terrible article called "The Führer Protects the Law," etc., until he loses out in a political struggle in a way not too dissimilar from Heidegger. In 1935, he's marginalized, but certainly not punished by the regime. The last thing I want to say about this very quickly, there's some excellent work. There's a book, unfortunately not translated into English, called The Decision. Schmitt invents the term in the late 20s, decisionism. The German book is called Die Entscheidung, The Decision, and it's a comparative study. It's by a political scientist named von Krakow, of three figures, Heidegger, Schmitt, and Ernst Junger, who's come up in the film already. It's about political existentialism. So I would say that the intellectual affinities between them are significant. And we have a brilliant essay by Karl Löwit, Heidegger's only habilitation student, called The Political Existentialism of Martin Heidegger, which I think very well explains the nature of these affinities.
I think Carl Schmitt helped write the Nuremberg race laws, didn't he?
He was certainly involved.
Yeah.
If I can add two small things concerning Schmitt and Heidegger. The first is factual. Professor Wolin remembers the important letter of Heidegger from August. There is a biographer, a German biographer of Schmitt, Reinhard Mehring, who very recently discovered that the two Nazi intellectuals met once the 8th of September 1933 at Berlin, near the Kaiserhof Hotel where Hitler was going. They were both called for becoming professorship at Berlin. Schmitt accepted it and Heidegger declined. He wanted to stay in his Freiburg. But in two seminars, that is the second point, it's a more intellectual point. In two seminars, I was the first to publish partly in a book, and now they are completely published. Heidegger is speaking very precisely about the concept of the political by Carl Schmitt. And you know very well the concept, the difference between friend and foe. And Heidegger doesn't deny the pertinence for him of that concept, but he said it's not originary enough. The true it's only a consequence. The true concept of the political is the Selbstbehauptung, self-affirmation of a people. And then comes the distinction between friend and foe. So the strategy of Heidegger is always to show that he's the most original, the most grundlich, the most referential thinker of Nazism.
Das Ursprüngliche, primordial, always in search of the primordial. Karsten or Tom, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, if there are more questions, I'd rather hear questions, but...
if I could just...
Yes, please.
I'm not a Heideggerian, so I hope I will be forgiven for asking a question that goes on to territory that you think we should all be familiar with. However, I found the film very impressive, but at the same time, it goes in a periodization that even I have been used to, and that is you have the big Heidegger blow becoming very, very famous, 1927, 1929, and then one eases over in your film, as in general discussions, to 1933, 1934, his Rektorat. And then, at least to me, there is the silence between 35 and 45 and onwards. He certainly has published, but is there a subtext? And this is really where I ask almost your forgiveness. Is there a subtext that would give indication of what we now need the black notebooks for in order to put our fingers on? I mean, the black notebooks seem to be a tremendous revelation, but Heidegger wrote all along. And is there a Heidegger whose language is silent, a la Derrida and Delman, or what? That's my question.
You want to answer that? I hope
that's a very, very good question. Thank you.
It's a very good question, and I hope that tomorrow we will shed some light on it. What I find most interesting about, first of all, you're perfectly right. There are all sorts of texts that, stretch through the whole career. Yeah. What makes the three, we bring the story up with these three volumes to 1941 or so. And what strikes me is that it gives us Heidegger always said that to interpret a poem or a philosophical text, the important thing is to first get hold of the Grundstimmung, he called it, the basic mood out of which the poet or the thinker is writing. I think this is terribly important. I think even in reading poetry, there's a good discussion with Steiger where he really thematized that. I think it's something well worth heeding. And I think in reading Heidegger, to get at his Grundstimmung now, I think there is no better text for at least that period that is covered by the Schwarze Hefte than reading the Schwarze Hefte. So I don't think it's so much what gets said there that I found revealing, but the shifting mood. And it is a shifting mood. That is, there's a descent into sort of spite, gloominess, nostalgia, but there's a clear change. So if you read you cannot just simply throw together a text from, let's say, 1933, and then from 1941. Something enormous is happening, and shattering is happening. And I think in reading the other texts by Heidegger now, one reads them with more open eyes, having read the Schwarze Hefte. So in that thing, I do think they make an important, but I hope that will become clearer tomorrow.
If I could just add one thing about the Schwarze Hefte. The volume that was missing and recently discovered this year, 2014, with the illegitimate child of Heidegger, that is in the archive in Marburg, and there are only about a few people who can actually read Heidegger's Schrift. And so that has to be gone through. But that's a very important book because that's the book that covers 45 to 46 in that area. And it should have stuff in it about how he reacted to the fact that he was denied teaching. Somebody talked about psychology. My wife, God rest her soul, she helped me on this film. She co-wrote it and we edited it together. She was a clinical psychologist, and she made it very clear that Heidegger was a narcissist, and as a narcissist was incapable of admitting any wrongdoing. And so that's a psychological interpretation. Another thing, too, is Heidegger, when he had his nervous breakdown in 1945, at the low point of his life, he went to a sanitarium where there was, I can't remember his name, I'm sure you know his name.
Binswanger.
Yeah, who was an existentialist psychologist, whatever that may mean. So he was involved with psychology at that time. So next question.
Yeah, please.
I have an unserious question and a serious question. The unserious question is, what's the name of that wonderful song and who sang it? But the serious question, I would like to hear some discussion. The serious question is, given your film and given the Black Notebooks, what are people supposed to do who believe that the question concerning the question about being, the question concerning technology, and other questions are important? And for those who have all along thought they were philosophically meaningless or worthless, what are they supposed to do with this information now?
That's a good question. To answer the first question, which was frivolous, Germany today has a fabulous, well, it's gone on since the 20s, a great tradition of political cabaret. And there's just tons of really sharp, biting, critical attacks against the German politicians, against everything, and they're very funny. And there's a group called Pilgor and Eichhorn, and they write music. And they wrote the famous Heidegger song. If you go into the internet, there's even a rock band that does a version of this. Was ist sein, was ist sein? You know, I was so down when I was doing this film at times, I said, I need to have a break. But I needed to have the rights for the music. So I called them up, they're in Berlin, and we spent an hour and a half doing jokes back and forth, and finally said, kid, you can have the music, we just want to have a couple of copies of the DVD. But they're highly critical, political cabaretists, and they attacked Heidegger with this song.
I would like to add a footnote to this. I hope that you all do listen to the song on the internet. It's easy to get. But you didn't give us the whole song. I sort of am sorry that you didn't do it, because there's also, da hat der Heidegger mal wieder recht. That was one.
Heidegger hat wieder recht.
Yeah, that was one.
I had it in my 6-hour version, I'm sorry.
Yeah. But I hope all of us will enjoy it. It's a very good song.
It's very clever.
Yeah, very clever.
Yeah,
we have a question over here?
Well, there was a serious question.
Oh, sorry.
You should have asked that first. I would expect that Karsten or Tom would have a good answer for that question.
You want to answer the serious question?
If you want to, you go ahead.
I think the serious question had to do with the fact that we have great difficulty reading Heidegger, because Heidegger really thinks that our whole culture, that culture which has led to so much that we think very important, democracy, science as we have it, etc., our modern world, in short, has missed something crucial. And that is the key to reading Heidegger. That's the Seinsfrage, is a question that calls into question the presuppositions on which our science rests, and that means on which our technology rests, and that means on the way it calls into question the way our everyday life has unfolded. And Heidegger, that talk, which will come up tomorrow because of that one statement where Heidegger's attack on Rechnen, on using numbers, becomes crucial. Heidegger thinks that we are no longer open to the particular in its particularity. That is, in a way, there's an interesting, we won't have that symposium, but that would be a really interesting symposium comparing Benjamin's essay on the fate of the work of art in the age of its technical reproducibility with Heidegger's origin of the work of art. There is a very interesting topic here that deserves really a symposium. I think there we could get at something very essential here. But Heidegger is afraid that we are so fascinated by seeing individuals under a certain rubric and thereby no longer do justice, not just to individuals, even to things, that we are no longer as open to reality as we should be. That's the key thought.
I need to add the other bookend here. As I said at the outset, I don't know if there's someone who writes on Heidegger from whom I've learned more than Karsten Harries, so I'm thrilled that he's here, and I appreciate his very sympathetic remarks about what we can still learn from Heidegger and don't deny them. But I would just like to add that one of the problems of the Black Notebooks is that we have someone trying to decipher and analyze and comprehend what the Germans and the French call actualities or contemporary events, basing himself on a standpoint that is 2,400 years old, relying on the Seinsgedanke, the thought of being, going back to Heraclitus and assuming that all philosophy and thinking in the aftermath, beginning with Plato, is a phenomenon of decline, Verfallsphänomen. And this is a big mistake. This is a big fallacy because it claims that we really, you know, to speak pointedly, we have almost nothing to learn from philosophy from the pre-Socratics down to Heidegger. This perspective, Karsten expressed it in a very user-friendly way, which I appreciate, a bit new age, but quand même. By the same token, there is a great potential for distortion and misunderstanding, and too sharp a dividing line between immanence, the immanence of every day, and Heidegger's standpoint of the history of being, Seinsgeschichte. And just think, those of you who don't read German can take my word for it, or can see what Karsten has to say tomorrow morning in his contribution. The level of distortion, miscomprehension, and the elephant in the room is that till the end of the war, even when things start degenerating and disintegrating, even when all the Jews have been removed from Freiburg and you know, presumably elsewhere in Germany, there was no secret about this. You can't keep the disappearance of 500,000 people entirely a secret. Heidegger is still supporting the notion of the German folk and conceiving of the notion of the German folk in its particularism as das Rettende, the saving power of the West. So I think both of these aspects go hand in hand.
You still didn't get your question answered.
No. Both of you gave very wonderful, succinct interpretation of Heidegger, but both of them could have been said without the film and without the Black Notebooks. How does the film, the facts in the film and the Black Notebooks affect the interpretation, whether it's...
Well, I did mention the Black Notebooks. I said this is a wealth of evidence that shows you how, you know, the perspective of being is incapable of comprehending current events.
If I might answer, I think what you wanted to ask is, how can these people who have dedicated years of academic work studying Heidegger's thought, how are they going to deal with the fact of what my film says and what the Black Notebooks say?
Both on a psychological level, but much more interesting on a philosophical level. What is the impact of the facts in your film and the facts that we'll talk about tomorrow, the anti-Semitism in the Black Notebooks? What is the philosophical impact on either being in time, which may or may not be affected by this, or by later questions in Heidegger that would then either mean it's worth continuing to study him or it's no longer worth studying him because it infects, which we'll talk about tomorrow, infects the whole stuff? That's the question. That's why I'd like to hear an answer to
and I don't think you've got an answer to that. Let me just answer it with a slight anecdote. When I showed this film at Penn State University, on the panel were distinguished scholars, including 2 Heideggerians. One was Dennis Schmidt, really a nice guy, very friendly, very nice. And I showed the film, and he was the first person to speak. And he looked at me and he said, I don't know what to say, but that's got to be the worst film I have ever seen. And then they came ready for bear. They attacked it right and left, which is perfectly okay. But what I saw there was, methinks he doth protest too much. He came up to me and he said, listen, I'm a serious scholar. I've worked 30 years on Heidegger, and you're coming around and you're making these glib comments. He said, I want to be taken seriously, and I think there's more to this than what your film says. But the question really is very primal, and that is, what do you do when you come to the conclusion that perhaps a great thinker was also a Nazi, and how do you reconcile that?
Or whether it affects his thinking, that's the real question.
It has affected some people's, but not...
I mean, we have 6 hours of conference tomorrow to address this question. I just want to, in defense and justification of just film, there's a confusion that comes up often, which is, I mean, this is a film. This isn't scholarship. It's a narrative. It's a construction, and it's suggestive. So it doesn't presume to solve any of these problems, although it does raise a lot of issues.
Okay,
yeah.
we have a question over here.
Yeah, we have to vacate the room in a minute or two, so.
Okay. Let's have the last two questions, and this lady over here.
All right,
very quickly.
I think two quick questions with quick answers.
Yeah. 1927, the year of the birth of the being in nothingness, Henry Ford apologized for his publication of the International Jew. Makes me wonder, Hitler having a portrait of Ford, Henry Ford, on his desk, makes me wonder what was Heidegger's views of the United States, Americans, and the British, specifically Bertrand Russell and his colleague Wittgenstein.
Very quickly, Heidegger knew nothing about America, had no interest in America, yet was quite ready to criticize America. He had no understanding of American culture whatsoever.
Well, it comes up in the Black Notebooks. America is just the representation of what he calls machination, calculation. He deals with America in the most superficial cliches. And this is another problem. Some of these insights aren't untrue, but they're just such partial and superficial truths that they really don't get us anywhere. Last question, please.
Can I add, I want to add something to the Wittgenstein reference there. The young Heidegger, the first lengthy publication was recent research, something like recent research on logic, which shows that Heidegger had read Russell very carefully, Whitehead, admired Frege a great deal, and calls himself then in the dissertation a mathematician in whom some historian for the first time awakened a sense for the importance of history. But when we talk about the development of Heidegger, we should not forget that he and the young Wittgenstein come out of the exact same logical milieu, so that the dissertation is in many ways surprisingly close to the Tractatus. And they're very interesting, that's an interesting discussion. So one should not think of Heidegger as somebody who just didn't look at Russell or Whitehead or Frege. No, he knew these inside out.
Okay, we have two questions right here. This man.
I think this was the next question.
He was first. I'm sorry. You're next. Go ahead.
Thank you. You alluded in the film to the denazification trials that took place after the Second World War. Everybody knows that those trials were basically farcical, and for example, Glopke, who was the principal author of the racial laws, the Nuremberg laws, he later became Konrad Adenauer's assistant. Kurt Kiesinger later became Chancellor of the Federal Republic. How did Heidegger escape denazification? That's one question.
I'm sorry. We have to leave the building in 90 seconds, so we'll have to stay with that one question. Thank you very much, and we hope to see many of you tomorrow morning and afternoon.